Hello and welcome to the Edinburgh University History and Games Lab podcast. In this series of episodes, we will be talking to historians, game creators, heritage professionals, and others about history, games, and the places where they meet. I'm your host, Eduard Gafton, and in this episode, I am very much pleased to be joined by Brian Train. Brian is a Canadian game designer who has been designing conflict simulation games for the civilian market for over 25 years, with over 50 published designs to date. His special interests in game design are irregular warfare, Pol Mil game, political military games, concepts of political influence in games, and asymmetry in games generally. In his spare time, he is an education officer in the Ministry of Advanced Education of British Columbia, Canada. What sets Brian apart from most other wargame designers is that he is interested in irregular warfare, such as civil disorder and civil or guerrilla conflicts, and wargames that have significant political elements to them. His published game designs include Arriba España in 1997, A Distant Plain, Insurgency in Afghanistan, 2013, co-designed with 𝐓𝐢𝐦𝐞, which was the guest on episode 10 of this podcast, Colonial Twilight, The French-Algerian War, 2017. A Distant Plain and Colonial Twilight are part of the 𝐶oin series, which we've discussed again in the 𝐂𝐲𝐬 episode, based around his game system presenting guerrilla warfare and counter-insurgency, 𝐶oin, around the world. Brief Border Wars, released in 2020, is going to be the main focus on this podcast. Brian, thank you so much for being on. How are you today?
I'm doing fine, Edward. Thank you very much for asking me today. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you for being on. For listeners unfamiliar with Brian's game, Brief Border Wars, it is a quadri game or set of 4 mini-games on short border conflicts of the 20th and 21st century, using a card-driven system that models the chaotic, stop-and-start nature of these impromptu wars. The 4 conflicts are El Salvador versus Honduras, so-called the Football War, which lasted about 100 hours in 1969, the Turkish invasion of Cyprus in 1974, China versus Vietnam in 1979, and Israel versus Hezbollah, Southern Lebanon, a region of Southern Lebanon, in 2006. So each game in this series takes 7 turns. Brief Border Wars is about aggression and was made for players to quickly finish one scenario and then jump into the other. Brian, we had 𝐂𝐲𝐬 recently, and so I want to start with your collaboration with him in order to link the 2 podcasts together. How was working on the 𝐶oin series, and how did you 2 get to working together?
Thanks. That's a great question to start with. Well, I got started in wargaming in about 1979. So I started playing then, but I didn't start designing until about the mid-90s, the earlier mid-90s. And from the start, I like to do games on political military topics and irregular warfare, as you noted. There was a game that I designed on the French-Algerian War from 1954 to 1962. It was called Algeria, not Colonial Twilight. That was a game I did later on the same war, but using a different system. And that game was the first game, I think, to be published in any language about the French-Algerian War. And I published it in 2000. And after the beginning of the American occupation of Iraq in the later 2000s, it started to attract a little bit of attention, I was surprised to find, among the professional wargaming circles. So at the end of 2007, I was contacted by somebody in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which is part of the Pentagon in Washington, about how he had used my game on Algeria as kind of the framework for a game model he was making professionally in his work on the Iraqi insurgency. And this is 2007, so that's getting quite underway at the time. And he invited me to a conference of a group called the Military Operations Research Society, which is a group of professionals, analysts and such, in the U.S. Defense Department, to go and see a presentation that he had made about his work. And so, yeah, I wanted to go see that. I attended this conference. I ended up making a couple presentations of my own about my work. And I was very surprised to see, that my work was actually known among professional analysts, many of whom were hobby gamers themselves, but I was gratified to see that they saw some kind of professional connection or linkage between what I was doing as a hobbyist, a civilian, and their work as professional analysts of contemporary conflict, where we had been working. So while I was at this conference, I met someone who was an instructor at the Sherman Kent School for Analysis, which is where 𝐓𝐽𝐻 was teaching at the time. So they were teachers together. And it ended up that I worked on a lightened up version of this 𝐂𝐲𝐬𝐬 game that this fellow could use in his classes, because the Algerian War was one of his case studies on revolutionary warfare. So 𝐓𝐽𝐻 saw him using this game in his classroom, and he picked up a copy for himself, and he went through it. And part of what was in that game inspired him to create the GMT coin system, because he was then working on 𝐷𝐷 and 𝐴BYSS, which was the very first GMT coin system game, and it was about the insurgency in Colombia. And so he he put that system together with some inspiration from the system I was using in my game on Algeria. I got to participate in a playtest of 𝐷𝐷 and 𝐴BYSS a year or two later, and that's where I could see where he was going with this particular system. I thought it was really interesting, and it amplified on a lot of points that I had been kind of fumbling around trying to make. And I thought that he was doing a good job of putting that together in a pleasing way. And after another couple of years, 𝐓𝐽𝐻 and I actually met at a conference on professional wargaming called Connections in Washington. And I think we really hit it off, and it wasn't very long before we agreed to collaborate on a coin system game. And as 𝐓𝐽𝐻 likes to tell the story, he let me pick the topic, and I picked Afghanistan, specifically because it was a real challenge. And also because it was something that was going on at the time. This was 2012, 2013, and NATO had not yet ended its combat mission in Afghanistan. So I thought it would make an interesting study, and it was particularly critical to try and take this game system and put it in a very contemporary setting, while the war was still actually going on. So that's how we got to meet, and it was very, very pleasurable working with him. He's a pleasant person who's open to criticism and always, suggestive and helpful to anybody and everybody who has an idea about something. He is a genuinely pleasant person. And as you discovered in your podcast, he's a very able speaker. He's a very good teacher. He's retired now, but you can see what a good teacher and lecturer that he made while he was working. So good story all around.
Yeah. Speaking of stories, I also want to touch on how did you get into wargaming? How did you spark this passion for wargaming? How did this all start?
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question. I did mention to you this before, but I started into wargaming in about 1979, and my uncle sent me a copy of Tactics 2, which is a very old war game from, it was in print for a long time, but it originally came out in the late 1950s. Very simple war game, but he sent it to me for a Christmas present, and it opened up this whole world for me, because I'd always been interested in military history, and war, like many boys were. And just to see that there was like this whole world of gaming and simulation and all the different topics it could treat of. I don't know if my parents ever forgave him for doing that, but I will always be grateful to him. And this morning, I happened to hear from his son that he had died yesterday, peacefully and at a very ripe old age. But he was a kind man, a considerate man, and I thank him for opening my eyes to this hobby and to this way of looking at the world as I've come to see it through designing games. And with respect, I'd like to maybe dedicate this podcast to his memory.
Absolutely, absolutely, and thank you so much for sharing this with us. Thank you. Now I want to speak and I want to touch on Brief Border Wars. How did you end up designing Brief Border Wars? How did that story start? How do you start with? Do you have an idea? Does the war come first? Do the four conflicts fall first, and then you kind of like wrap it up in a neat package, or do you just kind of like have a concept and then you find the wars that like would fit in your game concept?
That's a good question. It's some of each. Sometimes I get an idea for a particular game system. I've had about over 50 published titles, and about half of my games belong to maybe one sort of system or family of another, although there can be considerable variation within each game, although it kind of clings to a general system. But then there's about another 25 games that I've designed that are really one-offs. You know,
Hmm.
it's a system that I didn't use before and I didn't use again. So it's a little bit of both. Sometimes I'll come up with an idea for a system, or I'll hear about a particular conflict and I'll think, oh, well, maybe I could do it this way, maybe I could do it that way. But sometimes the ideas for the games themselves, they can come from lots of different sources. The Brief Border Wars, I would say, has its origin in something that was not quite a dare, put it that way. Because years ago, some people and I were kind of hacking around talking on Consum World, which
Hmm.
is a war game related website. It's fairly old, and usually like old school hardcore war gamers go there. Uh, and we were talking about short wars, and someone talked about the war, the 7-Day War
Hmm.
in Teschen, in the Teschen region in 1919. And that was a war that lasted only 7 days, and it had a beginning and an end. And someone was saying, "Oh, well, what would go into a Teschen game?" So I thought, and I looked into it, and I thought, well, it wouldn't be a really interesting topic, maybe. But I think the idea of a short war, like a game system that treated of games that were fairly short, bounded in time and space, and that ended up largely where the way they began, um, and were inconclusive, but could still be an interesting matchup, would probably be an interesting kind of idea to explore in a game system. So in 2015, I came out with a game called The Little War, which was a game about another war that was 1 week long between Slovakia and Hungary in
Hmm.
1939. So as Czechoslovakia was crumbling, as the Nazis were tearing it apart into different protectorates and things, there was a 1 week interval where Hungary decided to snap up a certain part of Eastern Slovakia. And the two armies fought a very, very short war for like 6, 7 days before the Germans shut it down and got on, with the rest of their preparations. Because this was March of 1939, so the invasion of Poland was
Hmm.
not so far away. But this was the kind of thing that I was looking for. It was very short, 7 days long. It was definitely bounded in time. It was definitely bounded in space because both sides had very limited forces that they could apply. Hungary had its military was not in great shape at the time. The Czechoslovakian military was even worse because it was being torn apart into a mass of individuals, and the Slovakian military, as an Axis satellite, was slowly trying to build itself out of this partition and this division. So it was really chaotic on their part. So they had all these sort of ad hoc units that were kind of pouring onto the battlefield. And things ended up pretty much the way they began a week before. And so I picked this particular conflict, and then I derived a very simple system that was driven by a deck of ordinary playing cards that would drive the action. And the idea was that the Slovakian player got all the red cards,
Hmm.
and the Hungarian player got all the black cards. But the deck of cards was mixed, so the red and black cards came out in you didn't know what order. So it would happen that one side would have more cards than the other and would be able to get more done in a turn, but would they actually be able to take advantage of that? And at the same time, the two different suits of the cards, hearts and diamonds, and clubs and spades, they were further divided into movement and combat. So maybe you could get, say you're the Slovakian player, and you luck out, you get like 5 cards, but they're all for combat. So if you're not able to move your units into contact, you won't be able to use them.
Hmm.
So again, You mentioned at the beginning of the podcast about this sort of chaotic stop and start nature of these conflicts that I'm talking about in Brief Border Wars. And that was very much that, because the two sides had really poor control over their own forces, and they had really poor control over the battlefield and the way things were going. And of course, the war, after 1 week was just boom, shut down by the Germans. So I think that was a good way to do it. So I had this game on the Little War, and it was included as the second game in a package of 2 games that 𝐓𝐢𝐦𝐿 put out. That's an American print-on-demand publishing company. And they put that out together with a game that I had done in 2014 on the Ukraine crisis of 2014. And that was a game that I designed not on a dare, but over a weekend in March 2014, when they had the referendum in the Crimea as to whether to join the Russians or not, and to restore from the days of the Soviet Union. And it looked like that there was going to be possibly an overt Russian invasion and a large overt war between Ukraine and Russia. As it turned out, it wasn't. But again, I took some time and put together a very quick political military game on the different dimensions of that particular conflict between Ukraine and Russia, where you can fight this conflict, but it doesn't necessarily have to go to a shooting war. So anyway, those 2 came out in a double package from 𝐓𝐢𝐿, and people seemed to like it. And I liked that system, and I went on to create this Quadra game, which is inspired from an old game company called SPI, or Simulations Publications, which is an American company active in the 70s and 80s. They really got the science of serious historical wargaming started and maintained. And they had this idea for what they call Quadra games. And you would buy 4 small games in a package, and they would have a set of core rules. They had them on all kinds of different topics. There were like ancient battles, American Civil War, World War II, modern conflict, and they all had different core rules, which gave you the basics of how to move, fight, and get your business done in the game. But then each of the games was about a particular conflict or a particular battle, and of course, each conflict or battle had its own peculiar circumstances. So there would be exclusive rules that would replace or augment or suspend certain rules in the basic rules. So that's a really interesting concept, because you learn the basic rules, and then that equips you to learn these other 4 games very quickly, because the basics of the basic mechanics are the same between all of them. And that's exactly the concept that I took with this Brief Border Wars quad. So there's a set of system rules, okay, that are only 4 pages long. And then there are 4 sets of exclusive rules that this one is for the Third Indochina War, or China-Vietnam. And they identify the forces and the parameters of the conflict, and any special rules or particular conditions that happen to be in effect for that game. So you read the basic rules first, then you read the exclusive rules, and then you're equipped to sit down and play the game. So that's, I think, a really good way to do it. SPI introduced the idea of the Quadra game, and it kind of died out with them too. So after about 40 years, I brought it back.
That's amazing. Yeah. And actually, that was going to be my first question on Brief Border Wars, is like, what does it mean for it to be a Quadra game? But I want to then transition to a different question. How was it to go from a large scale conflict like with A Distant Plain to then with Brief Border Wars? How did you have to change your outlook in like designing these games? What were the decisions that you made that were different from Distant Plain, for example, which was concentrated on a massive conflict from the get-go, and that was kind of like its scope?
Yeah, I've designed games at different levels of conflict. One area I usually don't touch is tactical games, which is where the units involved are very small, like from individual man to, a group of like maybe up to 100 people in a group. And where the time scales are very short and the ground scales are small. I've really designed only one game at that level, and that's Civil Power, which is a generic game about urban combat, mobs, riots, those sorts of jolly things. The rest of my game output has been either operational scale or what they call campaign level, or at strategic scale. And so I find the operational scale, which is where I would call, I would put these brief border wars games at the operational scale, because it's, in a sense, it's like a campaign. It's like an episode of fighting that takes place in the context of a larger conflict. Whereas within a strategic scale game, like A Distant Plain or Colonial Twilight, or the other counterinsurgency games I've designed using other systems, they may have they may be divided into campaign phases, but you are fighting a campaign and you're relating it into a larger house, like a larger context. And that's what you get with A Distant Plain or Colonial Twilight. With these brief border war games, it's a particular short-term phase of conflict. That's that's again bounded by time and bounded by space, and that drives many things. That drives many decisions when you're throwing concepts into the game. When you're doing research for a game, you need to be thorough and you need to be accurate, but you need to be choosy, and that's very important. I mean, we'll talk about accuracy in games later, but I think it's important to choose and to grade just what was really important. What are the points? Like any thesis, or like any work of art, you have an idea that you want to get across, and what are the main components to that idea that you want to get across, and you have to choose what supports that. And what doesn't support that, but needs to be included in the mention, in your work, and just how well supported is it, and just how consistent, how coherent and integrated is your thesis. So that's what you need to do in an operational scale game. You can't. There are certain things that you have to leave out. Like for example, it's pitched at a certain level where the penetrative powers of tank guns don't really matter very much. Okay, in a tactical level game, it matters. But on an operational scale game, the kind of things that matter are more like perhaps the command and control and communication systems that each side had, because you're maneuvering discrete units back and forth, trying to accomplish objectives. Now, the particular objectives that you're trying to capture may be territorial or they may be symbolic. Again, that kind of depends on the larger context, the strategic level, as to what are you trying to accomplish in this? Are you trying to seize territory, or are you trying to reduce the enemy's forces, or are you trying to make some kind of a symbolic, or psychological point? And the different games in brief border wars, they all have different contexts in this sense. So take, for example, the El Salvador and Honduras War, the football war. As you noted, that was only 100 hours. It was only about 4 days before the Organization of American States made the party shut it down. Now, people like to joke that, oh yeah, the football war, it was about a football game. Well, yes, that was kind of the trigger. But leading up to that point, there had been a lot of political and economic and social tension between El Salvador and Honduras because of the economic conditions prevailing in both countries. And there was a considerable conflict within both countries because of El Salvadorians living and working in Honduras and Hondurans living and working in El Salvador. And as the economies of the two countries started to fray and the governments became desperate, the El Salvadorian government decided that there needed to be some kind of an armed gesture,
Mm-hmm.
a very decisive gesture made in the direction of Honduras as a way of dispelling this tension and of diverting attention. Therefore, it's El Salvador is the aggressor in this particular situation, but there was a lot of tension that went on between the two countries for years before this very, very short war. However, that was a war that was designed to try and dispel that tension. Neither side was looking to conquer the other completely, and neither could have conquered the other
Mm-hmm.
completely, but they didn't want to. Again, there was a psychological point to be made here. Another example in this context is the China-Vietnam War of 1979. So China, at the end of 1979, invaded northern Vietnam, went into Vietnamese territory for a very short distance, and then left. And the ostensible reason they advanced was, well, they said they wanted to teach Vietnam a lesson.
Mm-hmm.
And what that lesson was, people haven't really agreed on. But again, this was a war that wasn't decided. The objective was not to conquer Vietnam, and it wasn't to destroy Vietnam as a country, but it was something that was there. The context there was psychological more than anything else, and both sides ended up discovering, a lot about the other side and how it fought. The Chinese armed forces, the People's Liberation Army, hadn't fought a war for 30 years. They hadn't fought anything since Korea. And in the meantime, of course, they'd had 10 years of turmoil as the Cultural Revolution. So this was a real shakeup for the People's Liberation Army and its leadership, because they discovered how badly their troops were supported, how badly they fought, how badly they communicated during the war, and how much of a disaster it was. And that put China on a path of modernization, economic and military and social modernization, and it really bolstered Deng Xiaoping, and his idea of putting China onto a different track where it is today. So if that war had never been fought, maybe the China of today would look very, very different. So sometimes these kinds of things can have great repercussions down the road. So those are psychological ones. And then the second Lebanon war scenario, that's the 2006 Israeli and Hezbollah one, partly psychological, but also partly kinetic or military, because in this match, you have the Israeli Defense Force, which is a regular professional military force, very high-tech, very hierarchical, going into southern Lebanon and engaging Hezbollah, which is an irregular force, but trying to reduce their ability to damage Israeli territory and infrastructure with their rocket and missile attacks. So that was partly a psychological war to kind of muscle Hezbollah out of there and teach them, who dominates southern Lebanon, but also to destroy Hezbollah's forces in the only part of Hezbollah's forces that posed a direct threat to Israel itself. So you have those kinds of things. So, again, with a strategic war, you have all kinds of political, social, economic, and psychological factors that come into play. And these, in turn, affect operational games like these brief border wars that I've been speaking about. Hope that's clear.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm just processing and I'm thinking. And you mentioned being choosy, and then my next question is, how did you decide on these four conflicts and why? Like, you've spoken at large about the repercussions of these conflicts, but like, what is it that unites these four conflicts? Perhaps is a better question in this sense.
Yeah. Well, I did touch on them before. My criteria, and I looked at a lot of different conflicts because, border conflicts are not as common now, but are a pretty common, aspect of modern warfare. My criteria were that they be fairly short. So you go from 100 hours in the El Salvador Honduran War to about 2 or 3 months in the China-Vietnam War. So first of all, they're short. They have a definite beginning and a definite end. So there is a time, each game is 7 turns long, but each turn can treat a very short period of time or a longer period of time, depending on what's going on and what's being reflected in the game. But they had a very definite beginning and an end. So the end is imposed by, well, the Hezbollah one is ended by a UN mandate. The Organization of American States finished, the 100-hour war in El Salvador. And China, Vietnam, well, China ended it by withdrawing unilaterally from Vietnam. So short beginning and an end, and confined to a peculiar or particular geographical area. Just where you have obviously the border, but not every part of the border can be the scene of a conflict between two countries. So in El Salvador and Honduras, the El Salvadorian player, who's the aggressor here, because of the way the mountains and hills lie and where the roads are between El Salvador and Honduras, there's quite a bit of border between the two countries, but only part of it is serviced by roads. So essentially, it divides itself into two fronts. So at the beginning of the game, the El Salvador player has to figure out how much oomph am I going to put between this front and that front. And in the China-Vietnam game, for example, that is very, very important. It's a very important decision for the Chinese player, because there were two front commands that were in charge of prosecuting the war against Vietnam, and they communicated very, very poorly with each other. So that is a real limitation on the Chinese player, and it's brought out in the game in that, when you play the cards, you're only allowed to play them on one front or the other. You can't do both. So that's an important limitation, historical and in the game, on the Chinese player. So again, confined to a specific area, and confined to a certain, let's call it a certain level of violence. The armies that are shown in these games are frankly not very good ones, or they've been thrown in they've been thrown into combat on very, very short notice. So El Salvador and Honduras, they're Latin American armies that are maybe not very high quality, not very well equipped. In the Turkish, the Cyprus 1974 one, you have a professional Turkish military that's doing an air and land invasion of Cyprus. So they're professionals, and they're faced by the Cypriot armed forces, which were not very good quality. And you have irregular forces on both sides that were more or less like armed mobs. So that's an asymmetry that you have to bring out. And then in the Israeli Hezbollah one, the Israeli army is one of the most professional armies in the world. However, they were committed in a very staccato, piecemeal way by the Israeli government, piece by piece. And of course, the Israeli army has a small professional corps, but most of it is made up of reservists. And these people have to be recalled from their jobs or their studies or whatever and assembled into their units before they're ready to go. And that's another aspect. That's another limitation on the Israeli player in that particular game. So that all contributes to the kind of chaos and start and stop nature, because these wars just, they just kind of poof appear, and they're fought for a short time, and then they're shut down.
Yeah, and you mentioned asymmetry, and I want to ask you, how does asymmetry in your games make for interesting matchups, and particularly in brief border wars?
Well, most of my games have some kind of level of asymmetry in them. It's very rare in any battle where you would find the two forces more or less identically organized, equipped, and led. Asymmetry is all about war, and you don't want, I think if you were a general, you wouldn't want to fight a battle against someone who was just like you, even though that's kind of how they train. You don't want to fight against someone who's exactly like you, because he's got the same advantages, but he's got the same disadvantage. You may have some knowledge of how to go about it, but you really don't want it to be fair. And so that kind of unfairness you kind of want to bring out when you're designing a game about an asymmetric conflict. You want to stress these asymmetries where they make sense. And then, of course, because they have to be a sort of enjoyable game, because that's what differentiates sort of civilian hobbyist games like what I do from professional analytical games, because they're not interested in making it enjoyable as a game. So with me, I have to, try to be as true to the history as I can, but introduce things into the game to make it an interesting, make an interesting matchup between the forces, and make sure that both players are challenged in trying to come up with, with a workable plan to win the game. And winning, of course, there's all kinds of different winning. So there's asymmetry in forces, there's asymmetry in organization, there's asymmetry in objectives. Again, like I mentioned in a couple of the games, like the Israeli-Hezbollah game and in the Cyprus game, there's a very large asymmetry between the two forces because you have professional Turkish military, although it's small in size and it's operating at the end of a very long logistical line. And then you've got the Israeli professionals versus against the Hezbollah irregulars. So there's that asymmetry, but they also have their own limitations. Like I mentioned, for example, the reservists who have to be mobilized. And the more reservists you mobilize, the greater chance you'll have of dominating, but you end up giving up victory points, which is how you win the game. If you mobilize too many, because that throws a serious wrench into the Israeli economy and society. So you don't want to do too much of that. And so then there's asymmetry of organization, where you have unity of command versus a divided command. And I touched on that, for example, in the China-Vietnam game, where it's the division between command elements in the Chinese forces is absolutely critical. It was critical in the war, but it's critical in the game as well. And that helps people to understand. Meanwhile, the Vietnamese player, the Vietnamese People's Army, they're working on what you call interior lines. So it's easier for them to switch from one front to the other. And of course, they have significant irregular forces of their own that pop up inside Vietnam, but behind the Chinese lines as they advance into China. So you can't really suppress them completely. And likewise, the Hezbollah game, Second Lebanon War, the Israeli player is trying to engage the Hezbollah combat units, which are shielding the rocket missile units. So he has to find them, engage them, and neutralize them before he can start destroying the rocket missile units, which is really the objective. Well, he has two objectives. He has, first of all, to destroy those rocket missile units. He also has to be left in occupation, in undisputed occupation of as much of southern Lebanon as he can, because that shoves Hezbollah back, because a critical factor is the range of the rockets and missiles that Hezbollah was using against Israeli territory. So they have two kinds of objectives there. So again, that's asymmetry of objectives. And in these games, one side is the aggressor and one side wins points for, occupying generally territorial objectives, but also for, slapping down, in some cases, slapping down the enemy's forces. So these are all different asymmetries, that were in the historical conflicts. We try to, I try to reflect them adequately and proportionately. That's an important word to remember when you're designing a game, in the game design. And then you try and work it even further. So in all of these Brief Border Wars games, there are sets of optional rules and variations that you can throw in further. So if you want to accentuate or mute the particular asymmetries in order to make it a more enjoyable game between you and your opponent, there's all kinds of rules that you can fit into the mechanism of the game. So for example, I was talking earlier about how cards that are divided between movement values and combat values, how they can be tweaked, and there's also special action cards which allow different forces to do different things or to refit their units or do other things like that. And of course, you can reduce that number of cards given to one side or the other to give them a disadvantage. And there are other rules that you can change or suspend. You can give guerrillas a little bit more of an advantage in knowing the terrain or not, as the case may be. And you can vary command and control aspects, which are by limiting how a player can play their cards. So these are all different little further variations and asymmetries that you can put into the game pretty easily and tweak the contest even further. And you can make it more historical or less historical, or it depends on your I guess it kind of depends on your ultimate objective. Do you want to have something that is tilted more towards modeling the actual conflict, which was probably highly asymmetric, or do you want it to make it a little bit more even-handed, and maybe a little bit more of an enjoyable or obvious contest between the two players? But those aspects of how to work asymmetry into a game is something that I've been doing through my whole career, my whole design career. It's not enough just to show how the different sides were organized or equipped or how they fought. It's also you can even work it in that they have different philosophies of warfare, different doctrines, to the point where they're actually playing different games. One of the games that I'm most proud of is also my simplest game with the shortest rules. It's called Guerrilla Checkers. And I was working on this particular game here, this one here. Sorry, I have to point this one.
There we go. Yeah.
This Kandahar one. Sorry, it's the screen's backwards. So that Kandahar game, I happened to be working on that with some other people. And I was lying awake one night thinking about the conflict in Afghanistan. And both forces in Afghanistan, the coalition and the Afghan government forces, sort of like the Western forces, and then you have the Taliban and the warlords who are irregular forces. Both of them are there in Afghanistan. They share the same time, they share the same space, but they treat the terrain completely differently, both the physical terrain and the human terrain. So essentially, I had the idea that you have these two opposing forces on the same map, in this case, but they're playing different games at the same time on the same map. And so Guerrilla Checkers is kind of a mashup of checkers and Go, where the counterinsurgent player skips over these irregular pieces like a king in checkers, and they can kill large amounts of and disperse large amounts of insurgent forces in one go. But they have to watch themselves against being surrounded and engulfed by insurgents, which is the Go part of the game. And you play it on a checkerboard. So games take maybe 15, 20 minutes. It's very, very simple rules. The game's got a few digital, it's had a few digital ports, but of course everybody has the pieces that they could play a game. But this is one of the simplest games that I've ever designed, and it's the one that I'm proudest of because it's the one that's distilled right down to the essence of asymmetry between the two. Where, as I said, you have the two sides are playing different games on the same board at the same time. And that's, again, it's such a simple thing. And I really, really wish that I had more simple ideas like that. It's so easy to come up with a complicated idea, but to work it down, to take that bloated initial idea and work it down to its essentials. I did a talk a while ago about simple games and the value of simple games. And there's a quote by Saint-Exupéry about, it's beautiful when there is nothing left to take away. And knowing when to stop taking away, I think is an important part of how you approach many things in life, not just game design.
It's beautiful, yeah. And I'm thinking all of the games that you mentioned, Tactics 2, Little War, Guerrilla Checkers, to all of these, I will add links in the descriptions for our audience to check out further. I want to get to the big question that we ask everyone that comes on the podcast about games and games being historically accurate. Should games be historically accurate? And I know we've touched upon this, but what is your honest take? And we just spoke about this simple design and not having to take anything away. But how about games that do have something that you can take away from in terms of how you perceive history and perceive historical fact? Should all games be historically accurate? Why are your games historically accurate is perhaps a better question. What is your take on this?
Well, yes, historical games should be historically accurate. A game like Stratego can't be really historically accurate because it's just red versus blue and it's an abstract contest. But where you're trying to touch on, where you're trying to present, let's call it the essence of an historical conflict. If you're trying to be serious about this at all, then yes, you need to be as accurate as possible. However, there are functional limits to that accuracy. This goes back to the earliest days of historical wargaming as a hobby. You know, it really got started in the late 60s, early 70s, when more and more games about historical conflicts started appearing. And I mentioned earlier about sort of like your bloated initial concept. So there were a lot of games that came out that were highly intricate, you know, and very complicated in their processes. Pages and pages of charts and die rolls and tables and all this kind of thing. And they were played on huge maps with thousands of counters. There are still games like that coming out these days. But back then, this sort of thing, nobody had done anything like that before, and people were really kind of wowed by it. But you had to ask yourself, as you're working your way through these things and getting bloody fingertips, sorting out all the counters, you know, into their little baggies between games, you have to ask yourself, am I really adding to what I'm learning about this game? Couldn't this be done maybe a little faster and we'd be learning the same lessons? So there's where the realism versus the playability aspect comes in. And if you shove it too far one way or the other, you're going to end up with something that is more of a chore to play than anything else. Now, there's always exceptions. You know, there are certain people who just absolutely delight in these kinds of things, and they don't think anything of spending, you know, days on end playing these games. That's fine. And I used to do a little bit of that myself. I don't really have much of the energy for that anymore, though. And then there's the playability, which can go too far the other way and kind of make a mockery of what is going on. A lot of people talk about, you know, Euro games, or, you know, having a theme, and then there's some kind of you know, they have a mechanical theme, and then they have some kind of narrative theme kind of nailed on top of it. So you've got like, oh, I don't know, set collection or worker placement or something like that. That's the mechanism you want to work for this game. And then you say, oh yeah, and by the way, it's about selling cheese in Renaissance Italy. You know, but it's a game about worker placement, but they'd like you to think it's about cheese. You know, but you're not going to learn very much really about the cheese trade in Renaissance Italy. You know, you're there to play a game, but the cheese part is there to give you the narrative. So war games are like that because they all have to have a sort of mechanical underpinning, but they have to have some kind of historical gravitas. You know, that doesn't bleed off too far into verisimilitude, but nor does it kind of like slough itself off into, you know, just kind of hand wavy, you know, mockery of it. And so that is one of the really, really great challenges to the game designer. You have to do your research. I think it's important that you show your work, especially when it's on a game on a controversial or tricky topic like Afghanistan. You'll understand that in the last few weeks, I've been writing and people have been talking to me a lot and asking me about, you know, is it possible in your game, in A Distant Plain, is it possible to mimic what actually happened? In the first place, you know, the short answer there is, well, that's not what the game is all about. The game was designed in 2012 or 2013, and the game ends in 2013, 2014, because that's at the point where the war becomes different. You know, NATO finishes its combat mission, and from then on, it's something else. I suppose if you back me into a corner, it would be possible to create an analog to what actually happened in the game, but only if you had certain assumptions or meta assumptions outside of the game and a lot of deliberately bad play on the part of the players for reasons that, again, lie completely outside the reference of the game. Essentially what happened in Afghanistan last month, if you want to use the metaphor of a game of a distant plane, is that the coalition player stands up and says, okay, I got to get up early tomorrow. The last bus is at 10:45. I have to be on it. This is my copy of the game, so we got to pack it up and go. And meanwhile, the Afghan government players been sitting here thinking, yeah, I got to get up early tomorrow too, so I'm really not interested in playing anymore. So it kind of like was the phase in the game where people are kind of brushing the pieces around on the board and trying to collect them by light color before they put them back in the baggies and put them in the box. Because there were political events and occurrences outside of the frame of reference of the game itself in the intervening 8 years between 2013 and 2021 that make this game no longer, a good model. I mean, it's like criticizing a game on the invasion of France in 1940, the German invasion of France, and then complaining, well, okay, this is about 1940, but it says nothing at all about the Battle of the Falaise Gap in 1944. What about the beaches of Normandy? You didn't say anything about the beaches of Normandy, but it's a 1940 game, So anyway, it's sorry, this is kind of clumsy that way. Anyhow, so I think that a game, I think a war game, historical war game, it's a work of art, like an historical novel is a work of art, or a painting, is also a work of art. In any kind of work of art, the creator, they do their research, they do their technical practice, they do whatever they do, and their product is influenced by any number of things. They have to be honest about these influences. They have to be honest in depicting the effect of these influences. And they have to understand, like everybody has to understand, that there is no such thing as a completely objective historical war game. There's no objective, it's just like there's no objective novel or piece of sculpture or painting or photograph even. They're all the result of choices that were made by their creator. And without trying to sound too profound about it, you cannot find something that will be perfectly balanced or perfectly objective. That's why I think it's important, especially with controversial subjects, to show that you've made an honest effort at your research, at incorporating a balanced viewpoint that has at least a weak analog to what happened historically, isn't revisionist, or if it is revisionist, it definitely shows its work, and these sorts of things. So yes, accuracy is important, but inaccuracy will be there. It has to be acknowledged. It has to be reflected upon, and everybody has to acknowledge and reflect upon it when they're going through it. The player and the designer alike.
A fantastic answer. Yeah, thank you very much for this. Now I want to transition a bit from just brief border wars in general and talk about the onset of the pandemic a bit, and even us collaborating in a digital space. Like us, many players have started using Tabletop Simulator to play your board games online. How did you find this transition from players gathering around the board to now playing board games on the computer? How was it for you?
Well, I'm old school. I'm 56, and I started playing in 1979. I am not a big computer war game player. I have never been a big computer war game player. This sets me apart in my, in my profession, well, not professional, but in my game design practice and my playtime practice from people younger than myself who grew up with computers and are far more familiar and positive towards playing on a screen. I understand that there are advantages that the digital format has in all kinds of games. And I think that there are lots of advantages in the physical format of games as well, playing face to face. The pandemic, of course, has thrown a wrench into all of that. So it was it was scarce enough that I had a chance to get together with other people before the pandemic to sit and play games. My city is not very big. Not a lot of people are into the same kind of games,
Mm.
that I was playing with. And of course, the people that I normally play with, they're also game designers. So we
Mm-hmm.
don't we normally don't play games that other people have designed. It's in a sense, it's sort of like a murder board, like a kind of semi-hostile play testing of what
Mm-hmm.
of what Ian or Brian or Stephen has come up with lately. So we tend to do that. It's kind of eating off each other's plates. But of course, with the pandemic, that went away, and so many people made the leap to digital. Me, reluctantly, I went to Tabletop Simulator because every attempt that I've made in the last 3 years to learn how to do Vassal. I don't know if your
Mm-hmm.
listeners would be familiar with Vassal. That's a computer program that ports board war games. It's used a lot for historical board war games. It had defeated my every attempt to try and learn it. And so I learned about Tabletop Simulator, and it's much better at creating a or a digital analog of a physical game.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to kind of try and strike the middle ground there. I learned it, and I got a little bit of facility with it. I have a few games of my own that I put up on Tabletop Simulator. Partly it was because of the pandemic, and partly it was because of home renovations.
Mm-hmm.
Um, about excuse me, about 4 or 5 months into the pandemic, my wife decided it was a good time to do some renovations in the upper part of the house, which included my study and my usual gaming area. Well, my usual gaming area is down here where I'm sitting right
Mm-hmm.
now. However, all of my office stuff, my day job came home, and then my day job came home and went into my study. Then
Mm-hmm.
my study came downstairs and established itself on the table where I'm sitting now. So everything was on here, and of course, I have no horizontal surfaces, to play on. So willy-nilly, I had to go to Tabletop Simulator because it was like the last playable surface left to me. So again, it was partly that it was the pandemic, yeah, in both wises, but not just because we weren't being able to be around people anymore, but also for me, it was because I lost, my physical space to do
Mm.
solitaire testing and modeling of games. So besides the tabletop modules that I've made for a couple of my games, Guerrilla Checkers is one of them. And I've been working on a couple of prototypes of games as well on Tabletop Simulator. I gotta say though, personally, I don't find it that great.
Mm-hmm.
I'm old school. I kind of like the feel of a physical prototype and of manipulating pieces, with my fingers and not with the mouse. It's the tactility of it. Like there's the direct face-to-face experience in being with a table of people and playing a multiplayer game that you just don't get, online. So it's a substitute. It's not the best substitute, but beats doing nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's I found it a challenge a little bit to get into Tabletop Simulator and how to put things together and move things around. But I like it a little bit more now. But as soon as things stabilize and we get back to talking and working with each other again in person, I think I'll be back to my physical map and my counters.
Mm. Yeah, and so will we actually at the lab now that I think about it. Yeah. You've written and spoken a lot about like self-publishing and the advantages of self-publishing, and I just want to ask you in general, what advice do you have for people wanting to self-publish their own games today? What is the number one advice you would give someone who's interested in self-publishing?
Do it. Do it. If you have an idea, if you've got something that stimulates you to the point where you want to put in the time and the effort to make a game, do it. It will pay off in so many ways. It won't pay off in money.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you that because I have been publishing these games for 25 years. As I said, I have over 50 verging on 60 published titles now. And all the money I have ever made, I'll be honest with you, all the money I've ever made in publishing these games is equal to about the first 7 months of pay at my day job, for this year. So a long time ago, one of my first publishing outlets was an outfit called the Microgame Design Group with a friend of mine. And for the amount of time that we spent working on these things, we would have been better off spending it hour for hour collecting aluminum cans, for the nickel deposit. Really, very few people make serious money off of games. And if they do, it's not from war games. The great majority of all the money I've ever made has been just 3 titles, A Distant Plain, Colonial Twilight, and Knights of Fire, which is a game that came out a couple of years ago about the street fighting in Budapest in 1956. So those 3 are responsible for the great bulk of the money I've made on this. So, you won't get rich in a monetary sense, but you will get rich in any number of other ways. Your research skills, your design thinking skills, your thoughts about how to present things visually and ergonomically, put it that way, how ideas relate to each other. It's like to design a workable game is to go through a successful exercise in systems thinking. I don't know if I haven't heard the podcast that you had last time with 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐿, but 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐿 probably touched on this whole systems thinking concept. Yeah, good. He explains that far better than I possibly could. And that's exactly what game design is. It's systems thinking. And because you have all these little systems that feed into bigger systems, and a perturbation in one part of the mechanism will have an effect elsewhere in the mechanism. And for you to put a game design together and tune everything and have it work like that, and yet it still says something, relevant and what you wanted to say about a particular conflict and of course, it doesn't have to be about armed conflict. There are so many games out there about political and social movements that use, Eurogame or sometimes war game type mechanisms to make points about this. I don't know if 𝐓𝐢𝐬𝐿 was talking about the Zenobia Awards.
He was, yeah.
Yes. So go and I don't know if you posted a link, but the finalists for the Zenobia Awards have come out, and oh my God, the creativity, among the finalists, and well, among everybody, but especially among the finalists, that the topics that they chose, not all of them dealt with overt armed conflict, or a lot of them didn't deal with armed conflict at all, but about social and cultural conflicts. Just brilliant, brilliant creativity. And yet, again, successful exercises in systems thinking. And to make all of that work will affect you in the way you think, the way you relate to your day job work, the way you relate to your studies, the way you relate to other people, and the way you relate to the world, and just how you set ideas in order and how you work them out. And if you really apply yourself, your writing will be better too. I have my day job is I work, as you noted, I'm in my spare time. I'm an education officer for the government of my province, British Columbia, that deals with post-secondary education. I've been in the public service for about 27 years now. My first few years were spent in a different ministry, the Ministry of Health. And I was looking for a different job. I wanted to go to a different ministry. And it wasn't very easy. And in the end, I found the job where I'm working now, over 20 years later. I'm very happy in it. And I was given to understand that one thing that helped me to get this job was the quality of my writing. And I put that down to having learned something about how to write game rules, because writing game rules is a very exacting form of technical writing and technical documentation. And of course, you have to, okay, you're a language man yourself. You understand about what has to be done in order to try and communicate clearly. And so the discipline that you have to instill in yourself in writing a clear set of game rules and getting your points across, that helped me get a better job. I'm very
Mm.
happy where I am now.
Yeah, that's a wonderful answer. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's about becoming rich yourself rather than like I suppose amassing, you wealth in that sense. Um, Heading to the final part of this podcast, I want to ask you just personally, which games would you recommend to our audience? What are you playing now? What kind of games are you into when you can, even in a digital space or in a physical space? What have you been playing? What can you recommend?
Well, I mean, people need to play the games like, well, I'm mostly an historical gamer,
Mm-hmm.
and people need to play if people are going to play historical games, I think they need to play the games that interest them most in terms of a topic, which historical conflicts or historical movements, they want to look at. I think that would maintain a lot of your interest because it's an effort of will to sit down
Mm-hmm.
and learn one of these things. Even a simpler game, even a simpler war game is yeah, among sort of the upper reaches of complexity for a multiplayer Euro themed war game. Um, it's I think that people have to think, if you've got an interest in a particular period, maybe think about games on that first, and pursue that route instead of saying, "Well, I want to play a game that uses the coin system." I think your interest would be like we get asked a lot of the time. I want to try this coin system game series. Which one should I start with? And the answer normally is start with the one with the historical topic that interests you
Mm-hmm.
most, because that's what will sustain you through learning the game, because these are unusual games. They lie outside the experience of a lot of sort of Euro war gamers or casual players, even video game players, setting aside the digital to analog flip.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what have I been playing myself recently? My own stuff. I spend more time playtesting my own stuff than I do playing other people's games. A couple of games that I've obtained recently that I really want to get some time to sit down and work out are Europe Divided. That's an interesting one. I've just been looking through the game, the rules there. It looks like a really interesting, although highly abstracted, look at the last 10, 20, 30 years in Europe. It's an unusual and looks to be a very thematic and fast experience. I've also been fondling my copy of Oath
Mm-hmm.
by 𝐂𝐨𝐬𝐬.
Who
𝐂𝐨𝐬𝐬,
we've had on the podcast, yeah.
lucky you. I have never met Cole, but I really admire his work. Cole is just brilliant. Root, I love Root.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the coin system. It's someone tried to say, oh, well, Root is just coin system with personas, and I disagree.
Oh
But
no.
but but Cole he's his own man. He's his own thing very much. And the other games that he's come up with, Pax Pamir, uh, um, the his game on opium trading,
Mm-hmm.
is and John Company. I haven't tried
John
that, but
Company, yeah.
yeah, it's just and now with Oath, I mean, okay, unfortunately, it's just me here playing these things, but I look forward to tussling with that, and the plays I've had of Root. I just again, I really, really respect him, and it's again, he's a brilliant game designer, and he's also a brilliant writer on games as well. There's an online journal out there called the Journal of Analog Game Studies, and a few years ago, Cole published an article in it where he compared and contrasted. Well, the name of the title was "Effective Networks at Play,"
Mm-hmm.
and he looked at A Distant Plane and two other games. One of them was The Quiet Year, which is a very interesting form application of role-playing games. Anyway, he definitely knows what he's talking about. He knows what he's trying to accomplish in a game design, and he's very articulate about writing about the kind of ideas and how he reflects them. His design diaries that you can see on Board Game Geek, against the particular games about how a particular game came to be, are just brilliant. So yes, I look forward very much to tussling with Oath and still playing Root. let's see, what else have I been playing? I got Mechanica a while ago
Hmm.
because I wanted to have a game by Mary Flanagan because I love what Mary Flanagan writes about games. A few years ago, there's an anthology that came out from MIT Press called Zones of Control. Volko and I co-wrote a chapter. Okay, so you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
Mary Flanagan wrote the last chapter in the book about war games, her experience of war games, and how she thinks war games should be designed, what kind of ideas they should put across. And that's just an excellent, excellent piece. I couldn't think of a better conclusion to that very thick book to have a chapter by Mary Flanagan in it. So I did do Mechanic, and I played it a few times. I didn't find it all that engaging,
Mm.
so I'm going to keep looking for other Mary Flanagan games. This one, didn't really do it for me. But I'm going to keep looking because she's another person whose work and thinking and writing I respect a lot.
Yeah, wonderful. I think that's a lot of like authors and games for everyone to check out. Brian, what comes next for you? What other projects can you tell us about that you're involved with?
Well, the first thing that's coming up is Brief Border Wars Volume 2.
Wonderful.
Yes. So after Brief Border Wars was published, it looked like a hit, and Compass Games, who published it, were very pleased. And I set to work on another set of 4 games. I had ideas for lots of different topics, but I talked to them and they said, well, why don't we try a set of pre-1945 titles? So the 4 that we have in this volume 2 are the Second Balkan War of 1913. So that's Bulgaria invading Serbia and Greece and places like that. Teschen, 1919. So as I said, I went back to that original Dare
Mm-hmm.
and I looked at the conflict again, and I thought, yeah, there is a game in here after all. And now that I had a system to make it work and make it interesting, there's a Teschen game in there. So Teschen 1919. The third one is Nomonhan, 1939, or 𝐂𝐤𝐬𝐿, as it's
Mm-hmm.
called. So that's the Japanese invading Mongolia and being met by Soviet and Mongolian forces. That one's kind of interesting. And then the fourth one, to round out the set, is the Italian invasion of Greece in 1940. So it goes up to December or so,
Mm-hmm.
the first sort of phase when the fighting settled down. So there you have a stretch of time from 1913 to 1940. The 4 games all have very distinct settings and peculiarities among themselves, and they're very different scales because they go from like rifle battalions, and companies in the Teschen game up to divisions in the Balkan and Italian Greek wars. And again, we have the same variations and options that are worked into each game, to make things more or less challenging for other sides. So Volume 2, I'm just doing a little bit of final editing on that. The pandemic has really affected my productivity just because
Mm-hmm.
of my day job is going through a really intense phase for the last couple of years. A lot of projects I've been working on, and just being constricted in physical space. And my father died about 5 months ago, which has kind of put a crimp in that as well. So a lot of the work that I was working on up until the winter, has kind of been in abeyance the last 6 or 8 months. But I'm going to be turning Volume 2 of Brief Border Wars into Compass Games fairly soon now. After that, I'll be getting to work on China's War,
Mm-hmm.
which is a game. It's a GMT coin system game I'm doing for GMT. It's 4 players, China from 1937 to 1941. So you have the Japanese, the Kuomintang Central Army, warlords, and the Communist Party. So it's a 4-cornered contest, and it's interesting. It'll be like the largest application of the coin system because the
Mm-hmm.
map is all of Eastern China and it covers four years of conflict. So we started, I got that to the point where it worked pretty well, and I put it in, it's now in playtesting. It's with a
Mm-hmm.
playtester and developer with GMT. Although again, the pandemic has really slowed things down for everybody's development and production. So I don't expect, people are waiting for it, but I don't think it's going to be out for another couple of years at least,
Mm-hmm.
just because of the problems with just simply getting games printed and produced and shipped back to the United States and sold. I've also been working on a revision, a drastic revision of a card game I did a few years ago called 𝐂𝐨𝐲𝐲. This is a game that I designed in 2013 on a very thinly disguised post-Hugo Chavez Venezuela.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a card game about power politics and about filling a power vacuum after a strong, charismatic character, a 𝐂𝐨𝐲𝐲, departs the scene. So who's going to be the next 𝐂𝐨𝐲𝐲? So it's in this made-up country. And I put out a game and a free version of it. There's a page on my website where with 6 or 7 free games on it that people can download and print out themselves. And that's one of them. However, with David Turczi, the guy I co-designed Knights of Fire with, we're working on a big overhaul of that
Mm-hmm.
to make it just a development of the idea, but just to make it a bit more engaging. And then, big secret project, well, maybe not so
Okay.
secret anymore,
The
is
scoop.
I've been working on another twist of the GMT coin system. And it's not about insurgency anymore. It's not even about war anymore. It's
Mm-hmm.
about politics. I've always felt that the coin system, which is essentially about asymmetric means and methods and opportunities, and of course motives as well, would suit itself really well to a power politics situation where people don't actually get shot or hurt. But it's a good way to model, some of the aspects of political movements between them and the kind of different powers that different political movements or tendencies can have between them. So politics is a fairly popular theme in Euro games,
Mm-hmm.
but they all go off in one direction or other. A lot of them are about factions within party politics and that kind of stuff. And that's kind of brushing up against it. So this is a reboot of an SPI game done about Canadian politics years ago, but now I've rebooted it through the GMT coin system, and I've been working on that. I doubt that anybody would want to formally publish it, but it's something that when I get it working the way I want to, because again, work's
Mm-hmm.
been kind of interrupted on that. When I have it done, I'll probably just make it available to people freely because it's about Canada and, not a lot of Canadian gamers and not a lot of people who are Canadian war gamers and interested in Canadian
Mm-hmm.
politics. But, hey, I do what interests me, Again, if you're going to be a game designer on your own, discard thoughts of riches, but think of everything else that it will give you in so many other ways.
Yeah, fantastic. So we have 4 titles to expect from you. Any pre-order links? Anything that we can look forward in terms of like anticipating? Like, is Volume 2, for example, of Brave Border Wars available to pre-purchase or pre-order in any way?
No, not yet. As I said, I'm going to be turning it into them quite soon now. John Krantz, who's kind of the principal motion guy, has just finished winding up a long game convention in
Mm-hmm.
Arizona. So I want to give him a little bit of breathing space before I send him this. But yeah, Volume 2 has been ready to go for a while now. And because it uses a already tested system, and some of the components are similar, the card decks and the rules, basic rules are similar. It's a question of getting the map and counter art together, and maybe a little bit more testing and development, but it should be able to come out fairly soon. It's up to Compass when they want to offer it for
Mm-hmm.
pre-publication, but hopefully maybe by the end of the year, although I think that would be asking a bit much. China's war, as I said, that probably won't be in people's houses for another couple of years, just because there's so much in the GMT pipeline, pandemic or not.
Mm-hmm.
But just the disruption to supply lines all over the world for all kinds of things, including board games, is just people are just going to have to be patient.
Yeah. Well.
But the other 2 titles, when I'm done working on them, I don't know if I can find a formal publisher for them, but if I don't, I will just publish them myself. And again, I recommend people take a look at that the lecture on game design or self-publishing that you've got a link to. That says everything that I want to say about why to publish and how to publish and what to do with it. So I hope that people will find that interesting.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and as you say, everything that we've mentioned in this podcast will be available to you via link in the description of the video that you may be watching or the podcast that you might be listening to. Okay, Brian, as we come to a close with this podcast, let me remind our audience that, again, a new academic year is about to start for us here in Scotland, and so we are ramping up our activity. Justin Biggie, the president of the History and Games Society, was presented the Society for Freshers Week here in Edinburgh at Edinburgh University. So we were very excited to see many of you come and be interested in the society itself. We've also had our first social event for the society that I was lucky to be part of, and I was more than happy to see familiar faces and also new faces from in and outside the university. So that it's always great to see people excited about history and games and the places where they meet. So we're looking forward to seeing more of you get in touch with us in any way, shape, or form. And in order to stay in touch with the society and the lab, at least on social media, do search for 𝐻NG on social media. That's for the society, and 𝐻NG Lab for the lab. Alternatively, if you have any feedback for this podcast or would like to get in touch for a potential podcast appearance, our DMs are open on Twitter at @HNGLab, or you can email us at hnglabpodcast@gmail.com. Again, all of these links will be available to you in the description. Brian, where could our listeners find more about you?
Well, the best way, I think, is have a look at my game design website and blog, and you'll have a link to that. I'm on Board Game Geek as LT Murnau, LTMURNAU. I'm also on Console World, but probably most of your listeners don't know about that. You can always get in touch with me. I'm happy to talk with people. And just pleased to engage with people about game design and about these topics generally.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Brian. If there's one thing you would like to emphasize, one thing for our audience to take away from this podcast, as we've discussed earlier, what would that one thing be?
Well, if anybody out there is interested in designing games or thinking of games as a means of expression, by all means do it. Even working towards something, that a project you might end up abandoning and putting away, I think it's all effort that will all come to the good. So do it.
Fantastic.
Do it now.
Once again, thank you so much for Brian for joining me. Until next time, everyone. Bye-bye. The Edinburgh University History and Games Lab podcast is a production of the Edinburgh University History and Games Lab. For more on us and future podcasts, connect with us on Twitter, Instagram, and or Facebook by searching for Edinburgh University History and Games Lab. We should be the first result. Music for today's episode is Call to Adventure by Kevin MacLeod, used under filmmusic.io standard license. For more information on the link and the license, please check the show notes. Thank you for listening, and please join us next time.